Okay, hello everybody. This is my first time doing this, and I'm gonna try and add Kelsey. Pop up. Hi, Joe. Okay, and I'll ask Kelsey.
Here I am.
Hi. I
Hi.
got you on. I don't know if I invited you as a collaborator. Will
Yeah.
will
Yeah.
it work okay? So it'll show up in your feed.
Yeah. I think so.
We'll
Yeah.
find out. Okay.
Yeah. I
It's
think
good
so.
to
I
see you.
think it's exactly what I usually do. So
Okay.
good to
Good.
see you.
I feel like I don't want to do this like learned helplessness. Like, I will never do this.
No.
Hi, I'm seeing all these faces come in.
Yeah.
It's great.
Hello, everyone.
Um, hello, friend.
Hello. Happy Holy Week. I am not a
Yes.
clergy spouse. You are a clergy spouse, and
Yeah.
my heart goes out to you.
But you are a musician, so you probably have some familiarity with this is like, right?
Yes, I am not involved in Good Friday or Easter services at our church this year.
Okay.
They mercifully, I think, try to avoid asking parents of young kids
Oh, yeah.
when possible. So actually,
Yeah.
my parents are both musicians at our church, so they are involved. But my husband and I are not. So that's kind of a nice. We
Yeah.
don't have to worry about it this year. So.
Well, and while we're waiting for people to join, I'm curious because sometimes I'll see you tweet about doing music. What do you sing? Do you want to talk if you don't want to talk?
Yeah. I usually
Curious.
at our current church right now, I just sing. I also play keyboard. I am very mediocre piano player and very nervous piano player. For whatever reason, it makes me very nervous. So when there's someone else who is able to do it, I'm happy to just sing. My husband plays guitar and sings as well. So usually we aren't leading together because we switch off Sundays or just because of kids, it can be very complicated.
Yeah.
But yeah, as you know, I mean, as you of course know. So
Yeah. But yeah, I so respect, we have some wonderful musicians at our church who are parents, and yeah, I respect that so much because a lot to juggle on a Sunday morning.
It is. What does the music setup look like at your church on a normal Sunday?
Yeah, so because it's an Anglican service, the tables, the center, so the musicians are kind of off to the side. Do you mean like location wise? But then we have, so then we have a liturgy, really the Eucharistic liturgy from the Book of Common Prayer. So, there's like an opening hymn with a processional cross down, and then there's service music throughout, and then a couple songs during receiving communion, and then an exit hymn. So it's a little bit different than, growing up, I was in we went to kind of hodgepodge of traditions. So a little bit different than the kind of more gathering worship, preaching, response worship, but some of that. So
anyway. Is it a band or is it like a couple musicians? Like what?
It can vary. It can vary depending on which musicians are doing it. Like sometimes it can just be pianist with the vocals, or a group of musicians. Sometimes there's, I'm going to embarrass myself by not knowing the names, different kinds of percussion, the kinds you play with your hands. So people doing that. And, sometimes there's a violin or guitar often. A couple of vocalists, and then sometimes during certain seasons they'll do a choir of like a late of just people in performing certain music, especially during Advent or Christmas or Easter.
Yeah.
What about you? Is it?
Ours is a pretty straightforward evangelical kind of I don't know, very band led, like what you think of, like our church uses kind of what you think of as like the big four worship music creators of the moment. So like a lot of elevation, a lot of passion, a lot of Hillsong, and very much sort of the tech set up to go along with that. And I've not always been at churches that have that, but we are right now. I'm singing up there usually with like the click track in my ears and all that kind of stuff, which is still kind of a strange thing to me, but get used to it.
I love it. Well, I love it all. Back in church planting days, it's like I would drag out, because I can play the piano. It does not make one a church musician. But when there's desperate times, you know, you're
Yep.
like, okay.
Yep.
So I have enough of a glimpse of it to know that so much goes into it.
Yeah.
To, you know, it's such an active service. So anyway.
Well, I hope your services go well this weekend. I hope everything is smooth and not stressful. And
thank you. Yeah, they start tonight. I think there's just the Tenebrae service. So different things, but my husband isn't involved in all of them. So that's good. So anyway, but actually we just recorded, and I wanted to mention it because we're about to talk about all the things we're going to talk about. We just recorded a liturgy for the Stations of the Cross so that people in the parish can kind of listen to it if they want. But as we were recording it, him and I together, I was just thinking about this in light of everything we've been talking about sin and atonement, and the way Christian parenting teaching, it's almost similar to what you see in Tripp and stuff, referencing the scriptures, references these deep theological ideas and mysteries in passing a lot, of kind of like a nod to them or a little dip to them. These maybe, I don't know. It just struck me afresh that these are deep mysteries of the Christian faith that are robust, that are multifaceted, so many different motifs of atonement we receive in scripture and throughout church history. And often it shows up in Christian parenting tossed out in a sideways way. Is that still way doctrine again?
Yeah.
And I think it's really a shame. That's where I landed when I was reading some of this. I was like, oh, it's a shame. It diminishes the mysteries and also can be manipulative to the people on the receiving end.
Yeah. Yeah. It diminishes the mysteries. And I think because parenting books by nature have to be like kind of weirdly pragmatic for them to be marketable, these kinds of ideas about sin and accountability and age of accountability, any of those things, do not lend themselves well to pragmatic how-to books that are trying to prescribe solutions. And I've yet to see like a parenting book that isn't sort of just like about being a parent. And anything that starts to offer pragmatic advice is going to have to like just reduce down all these mysterious, complicated things, in really unhelpful ways, I think.
I think so too. And I think it's like, here's an example. This is what I was thinking of, and then we can get into whatever you want to get into first. I was thinking of how often people will pull out the Hebrews 12 passages, the Hebrews 12 passage, but there's several verses in there that are often translated discipline. And then you'll hear that kind of referred to as, well, Jesus learned discipline as a son, we should discipline, parents should. It's kind of this convoluted, like, here's an idea, and it's braided together almost to be like, therefore, because parents are like God, we'll talk about that in the Piper article, the assumption that parents are supposed to be acting like gods, and then we have this idea about discipline, and then it's mixed together, you're right, with the pragmatics of parents being like, well, how do I do this difficult task or frustrating task or whatever they're feeling in that moment. And the output uses a lot of theological language, but maybe isn't even theologically sound. Like, I was thinking about this. I'm going to read this one. This is from the second station. This is from, I believe, the Book of Common Prayer. But it says, although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And I was thinking about that in light of what we hear all the time in the Christian parenting books. And here we have this idea that it's an anomaly that a son would learn through suffering. That is the way that, to use the metaphors of scripture, the slave versus sonship, like that is not the way the son would be necessarily through suffering. And that's what's so like astonishing about Jesus doing that, so worthy of notice. And so even thinking about that then those types of things get woven in, and not only do they force Christian parenting practices, but they diminish the theological riches of the faith in this very I don't think people are meaning to be utilitarian about it, but that's kind of what it feels like. It feels borderline sacrilegious in some ways to just co-opt these huge concepts
Yeah.
to certainly to sell a book, but especially to kind of elevate one's own opinion to a sacred level. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, gosh, there's so many ways we can go. I don't know where you want to go from here
Right.
first. Like, what to dive into first? Um, but yeah, that the son learned through suffering. This semester in my worship in the arts class, I'm teaching from Henry Nouwen's Prodigal
Mm.
Son, Return, or the Return of the Prodigal Son. Um, and we spent a lot of time talking about that parable and the the picture of the father that we get in that parable is so disinterested in teaching the son through suffering, right? The father is so disinterested in anyone getting comeuppance. He's so disinterested in the you get what you deserve, and I love that parable because what the son does suffer, the son does not suffer at the hand of the father. The son suffers
Absolutely.
at his own
Yeah.
his own hand, his own making.
And he's given freedom to do that.
Yeah.
There's not this sense of, like, makes me think of the Piper article. There's not this sense that the father's like, it's my job to force my son to obey from the get-go.
Right.
The son has agency, is welcome back. And who do we see uncomfortable with that is the elder brother, who is uncomfortable with the fact that there's no punishment, that there's no, I mean, the posture of the penitent son is, I'm not even worthy to be called a slave. And the father's not having that. And there's not atonement. There's not some sort of penal substitution, anything going on there. And I think the parables of Jesus are never intended to be complete theological statements in that sense either. But we don't see that. And we see that the elder son is welcome to, I mean, I find it touching that the elder son is welcome to, even though he can't get over that hurdle. And the father's posture to him is also of welcome. All that I have is yours, he says. Come to the feast. So, yeah, I think we know those stories so well, but then our theological imaginations get formed by these slivers, I think, more than the whole counsel of scripture. And I was thinking about this as I was thinking about, because of course it's Holy Week as well, and just seeing different conversations on social media about different theologies of atonement and thinking about the ways those developed throughout history. And I think for a good portion of the evangelical church, there's just an unawareness that those things have developed and have changed, that even what we think of as most commonly this idea of substitutionary atonement is a motif that gained prominence in reaction to theologians not liking the earliest one, which was more ransom atonement, and saying like, well, we don't think that, because the short version, I guess, the ransom theory of atonement that the early church would have primarily understood or widely adopted would have been the language of buying back, that God needed to kind of buy people back from Satan, and surprise, it was almost even like tricking the trickster, like kind of got the better of him. And you see this in things like, if you've read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you can kind of see this a little bit. He's pulling on some of those threads. He's kind of mixing them all. But then you have in the Middle Ages theologians like Anselm who are like, that felt like that diminished God's honor, because they're in the medieval mindset. So they're like, no, a feudal lord, like, no, Satan does not need to be paid a ransom. Like, God would not be beholden. And so then there's this idea of like God's honor needs to be satisfied. And come through to the Reformation, I think you see in our day people becoming uncomfortable with the substitutionary owner. We don't like this idea of God's honor. We say, well, that makes God seem very egotistical, and like, why does he need that? And so I think we get into trouble when we put on this lens that I think these lenses were not meant to be definitive in a sense of idolatrous. They were a multitude of lenses given to us to help us understand something beyond comprehension. And there's many of them throughout scripture that we don't talk a lot about. Aaron and I, my husband and I, were just talking today about the snake on a pole from Numbers. That's one we don't talk about because we don't know what to do with that. There's no atonement in that story. There's no sacrifice. There's the serpents being said. I mean, it just is very uncomfortable one to read, but Jesus himself references it as a picture of what the work he's going to do. So I think what we get into trouble when we end up picking this view of atonement that is supposed to be a lens where we can see something. It's a metaphor for something greater. And then we take that metaphor and we fixate on it. And then in Christian parenting, we start to like shape practices based on this metaphor. And that was the best way I could kind of encapsulate what I see a lot when I see theology woven in these teachings. It's like people have picked up on a metaphor that is helpful to them to understand atonement, to understand Christ's work. And then they've made that somehow prescriptive for how they should parent,
Yep.
Which is an odd place to land with it, really, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I was just having a conversation with my dad about that. He was talking about, because he'd been watching some of this chatter that I've been posting, that you posted from the Reformed.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Saying, he was on staff with Campus Crusade for Christ when the new Reformed, kind of the neo-Calvinist, like during John Piper's ascendant years, right? Like this was like the very beginning of that. And he recalls that on staff at the time, there was incredible division over this attraction to this all-encompassing closed system idea of atonement that could explain things and be applied to certain things. Parenting in a very systematic way was so attractive to so many people on staff. And if you know anything about Campus Crusade for Christ, the people who are attracted to that are attracted to things that can be systematized, right? Like these are people like systematized evangelism and the structure of a ministry. I mean, it kind of like, we often talk about how it kind of replicates MLM structures in a lot of ways. For people who like this kind of systematic.
And it collided with how that was going on in the broader culture, right? You have nouthetic counseling doing the same thing. You have self-help movements, I mean, I think all that swished together. Absolutely. So it was division or cause division.
Yes, caused a ton of division. Because there were a ton of people on staff who really had not, my dad did not grow up evangelical or even really Christian. And he kind of had a conversion experience in high school. And so for him, it just felt like this weird, like out of left field, very extreme move for a lot of people that he was interacting with. And it's funny because when I was in college, there was like that was when Mark Driscoll was ascendant, which is like a whole other reemergence of that yet again.
Right.
During a new generation of people who are attracted to that kind of systematized, even like fundamentalist thinking about atonement and what that looks like and what it means practically. And the ability to use that to interpret experiences with people, children. It's just amazing to me how cyclical that kind of thinking is.
Absolutely. And we see it again now, right? In different iterations with Douglas Wilson and groups like that, Wilson was around in Driscoll's years as well. But it makes me think of even, years ago now, this would have been, I don't know how many years ago, 15 years ago, something like that. We did a little, with my eldest child, we did a homeschool co-op. It was our first, it was like a preschool. And it met at a Mars Hill campus. And I didn't know at the time, we'd recently moved to the area. I didn't know much about the church. I knew who Mark Driscoll was, but I still remember in the room we met, it was like a Sunday school room. There was like a wall, and for some reason they had stored all their Sunday school materials, and the children were going through a book of doctrine. That's what the Sunday school, I guess, curriculum was. And it was, of course, Mark's curriculum, but it was interesting to me, even at the time, I didn't have the kind of vocabulary I do now, but it seemed so odd to me to think of that. But that is the natural outflow. And I think what you see in bleeding into things like Christian education materials and church curricula and things like this, because the doctrine becomes everything, all consuming, and the import. And I don't want to diminish. There's a reason we value orthodoxy and orthopraxy in the church throughout the ages. Like, that's a value, but the way it looms and takes over everything, like having the right doctrine becomes everything. And if not, like even just this week on Twitter, someone in my own denomination had posted, there was this whole thing which gets into Anglican funniness, but someone had posted a piece about like a case for Baptist Anglicans, which just is not, it's kind of like a theological impossibility, but of course it caused a kerfuffle. And there was someone on there who said something about not liking that, but saying they really didn't like it because they did not want their children to be confused by unwashed, unregenerate other children.
I saw this.
Yeah. And I was like, I had thoughts, I had things to say, but I thought it's so interesting because I think when you're in that headspace, you think, oh, but this is about defending the faith. This is about the importance of doctrine. And there's not, and the right doctrine looms, and that's how you get people in those Facebook groups, I think, who are like, oh my gosh, because of my love for doctrine or my commitment or my zeal, my religious zeal, I feel like I need to be disciplining my 8-month-old because they're wiggling around and they might be sinning. Or Samuel Say's tweet where he's like, oh, it breaks my heart, I'm heartbroken, but my 4-month-old is a sinner, and so I know I need to discipline him. And even if he is just talking about sleep training, that becomes the lens.
Yes.
And it's so I just think it robs us of so much. It steals, kills, and destroys is always the refrain that comes to mind, because it robs us of the kind of normal human interaction, the grace of human interaction, the gift of relationships, of being in family and community, and it robs us of the mysteries of the faith because it packages it all down. And I think if we're working through our little workbooks so we can master the doctrines of God, what do you know, when you reach young adulthood, that little workbook, you outgrow it and you exit because you've mastered it.
Yeah. So let's like touch on like a couple. So there are like a couple things there that like we should maybe explain and
Sure.
then dive into, because there's the stuff that happened on Twitter where someone posted about being heartbroken over needing to discipline 4-month-old, and then later had to clarify what I meant by discipline was sleep training, right? So there's that whole kerfuffle, and then everything that followed from that. Yeah. But then separate of that, you posted some screenshots from this Reformed Parenting Facebook about people kind of asking for advice and strategies for specifically for spanking toddlers, how and when to spank toddlers, like under the age of 4.
Yeah.
These things are very related to me. And to me, this is just, I mean, I first want to start by saying like some of those posts from that Facebook group really just, I mean, were heartbreaking, first of all. And second of all, are just an example of this ahistoric understanding of Christian parenting practices, right? This idea that like, there's this like true, we're not going to be moved by emotions or by these like emotional responses. We're going to do what's right. We're going to follow this timeless advice, when what they are asking for is not timeless advice at all. What they're asking for is a very recent innovation in how people think about what corporal punishment is, that has more to do with what's happened in the 20th century than it does with how anyone was ever thinking about child discipline before the 20th century.
Oh, tell us more about that. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
I mean, I've been doing some research on and doing research on other people's research, right? This is not my original research. There have been people who have been studying the history of child discipline, corporal punishment, and parenting practices for a long time. This is not new research. This is stuff that a lot of Christian parenting literature just sort of conveniently ignores. And that is that the the best records that we have of what corporal punishment has been for adults and for like school age children. Like that that corporal punishment has been used on adults since ancient times. That was sort of being whipped, or whether that was wives being disciplined in a domestic setting by their husbands. We even have, there are like even films from like the mid 20th century where they're like what are supposed to be kind of comical depictions of wife spanking. That's very well documented. It is also very well documented that corporal punishment has been a tool of religious education institutions for centuries. We have records of Jesuit missionaries using that. There's sort of in popular imagination Catholic schools as being a setting where that it has also happened in public schools. It's not just in Christian schools, but the best records that we have of teaching children to behave through pain and through the threat of pain and through the infliction of pain has primarily been systematized and defended for older children who I'm telling this child to sit still and behave in class so that they can learn spiritual things in many cases, and having that as a threat there. The spanking of toddlers and pre-verbal children, that, at least from what I am finding so far and what is relatively new. Has it been practiced throughout the centuries? Probably in some time, right? But never has that been considered to be this sort of systematized commitment within Christian parenting, really until the 20th century. Partly as a reaction to the suggestion that children have rights and that the state can step in and protect children from parents if something goes wrong. That is a 20th century innovation that still makes a lot of Christian parents very uncomfortable. And it kind of it kind of like flips this countercultural switch that a lot of fundamentalist Christians have, where almost like, oh, the government's telling me I can't do this thing. This must be persecution, or this must be a thing that the government is going to take away from me. It kind of like creates this psychology of like doubling down on something that I'm not sure as many Christian parents would double down on if the threat of it being taken away wasn't there. So anyway, that's a lot of history. Just to say that this idea that like we have to spank toddlers, how else will they learn right from wrong? That's like, as far as we can tell, that's a relatively new way of thinking about it in terms of like putting a spiritual kind of command on top of that. I'm sure many parents over the centuries have felt that way, right? Like I have a 1-year-old, I'm pretty sure they know what they're saying. I'm pretty sure they know what they're doing. I'm going to swap my 1-year-old. I'm certain that has happened.
Right.
But what we're talking about now when we look at shepherding a child's heart and this kind of system, how to implement spanking in a spiritually responsible way, because we're coming to, that is new.
I think so too. And I think the behaviorist element, even shows up in Dobson and things like this. But I do think there's a switch that then you see in the more reformed camp that begins to speak with certainty about things that I think you've mentioned before. Theologians have differed and not necessarily spoken with certainty, because I think we do have things even in scripture like, is it in Nineveh, where there's children who don't know the right hand from the left? It might not be in Nineveh, but in the book, The Prophets, there's this distinction of some very young children don't know right from wrong, even as a Judeo-Christian concept. And so really it requires doctrines of total depravity, which is how I think you get to this 4-month-old is a sinner, and I know he's a sinner and needs to learn discipline. And because I think even if I'm thinking about maybe the Puritans or Congregationalist movements in early American history, you have high standards for behavior, right? And whether, I don't know, it'd be interesting to look into whether adults in the community are corporally punished in the same way. But I know certainly there was, I'm thinking of Jonathan Edwards, I know certainly it was like if you were not attending church, if you were not doing, there were community punishments to make everybody comply with behavior. So I would think that would be evident in the home, but I think it was not tied in the same way to this sense of like infant rejection of infants. And I do think this is where infant baptism comes into it, which is how both of these, this other tweet, play into it, because thinking of a Roman Catholic friend and I were having a brief conversation about this, in the theology that would predate the Reformation, you have infants being baptized, you have a concept of this age of accountability, you have confirmation coming later, you have the dual belief in original sin as well as willful sin. But I think there, for the vast majority of evangelical churches, there's Bible study based doctrine that is usually being mediated through a preacher, which is why you get like the Mark Driscoll effect, which I think is distinct. It's very distinct, because then it's filtering some of these things out. And when it goes awry, it goes really awry. And I think I have the whole stack of books showing parents being instructed to do this with very young infants. I mean, the Reformed group, someone messaged me when the Samuel Sway tweet was going around, and I thought this is important because I think a lot of Christians, certainly outside Christianity, have no idea that this kind of practice goes on. Yeah. I think. And I think even within Christianity, I heard from some Christians in the UK who are like, is this a uniquely American thing? Like, we've never heard of this.
Yeah.
And I think there's certainly some pieces of that, but I think, I mean, some of these books have circulated to millions is the claim.
Yeah.
Many millions of families. And then you mash that theological strain in where people are trying to take these doctrinal things with the legacy of Dobson's behaviorism. He was very open about it. Now have you read some of his later stuff? Because I've only read Dare to Discipline. And I think I mentioned before, I was so surprised to find that I think there's like a page at the very end where he starts to talk about Bible verses, but it's very much just behavior. There's a little bit of like, we all know God wants parents to be in charge, but there's no real theological case made throughout it until the very end. There's some Bible verses. And I thought, oh, this feels very different than the Dobson of later years. Yeah. What in his later stuff, does theology show up? Does doctrine show up? Or is it still pretty much all about authority behavior?
So I think, and I have not read all of his books, I'll say, I do think
good. There's so many.
There are so many. They do get more spiritual, but they're still surprisingly trying to appeal to as broad a possible audience, as ecumenical an audience. He's trying to capture also the sort of cultural conservatives as well, the social conservatives who are maybe not all that religious, but would share some of his social and political interests as well. So yes, he does. He also, in some cases, reserves the religious language for like his radio show, or there's a video that he made that was shown at churches all over that tend to have a little bit more of that. A lot of his books, though, like you mentioned, they're manuals. They're like parenting manuals, and they're manuals from this like matter-of-fact, common sense voice that is not always pastoral. It's much like a high school principal kind of matter-of-factness. And, you know, I'm reading a book right now, or I'm rereading one. And sorry, what's the title of it? Called Anxious Parents. It's a history of 20th century American parenting. And one thing that this author points out is that, and I think this goes to your friend from the UK who you know, American individualism, the way that that has bled into American evangelicalism and the publishing industry, everything. You know, the hyper individualism of even things like child behavior, and hyper individualism of the idea of total depravity, right? Like, I might not share a diehard commitment to total depravity, but when you take total depravity and you marry it to hyper individualism, you can see how you end up with parents looking with laser focus at their children and particular behaviors and just trying to drill down and figure out what the sin is there. And I don't think that you get that same effect, that same fixation, without the hyper individualism. And this author in Anxious Parents points out that James Dobson and John Rosemond, who is another parent writer who is a little bit less Christian-y, but still I think appeals to that's what he would say is their defining characteristic, is their hyper individualism and behaviorism, moralism even.
Yeah.
I find it interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
I'm just amening you. Yeah, the moralism becomes a piece. Yeah.
So I'm really curious to know about how you found this like, because when I was like off Twitter for a couple of days and I got back on Twitter, and all of a sudden there's like just this explosion of stuff around this post that I forget his name, is Samuel C. Say?
Yeah, S-E-Y. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with him.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know his work, or he's a writer and speaker and has a platform.
Okay.
But beyond that, I don't know much. But clearly he's reformed. I think that's a fair guess, I could say, from his tweet. But
so I'm curious to know more about what your interactions have been with people in the wake of all of that, because you really quite a lot. I do not have a ton of interaction with the hyper reformed camp personally. So yeah, I don't know. What has the aftermath of that been?
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, for those who are following along, because it popped up and then he deleted it, probably because he got people asking questions and concerns, and obviously concerns for the infant. And I think for me, of course, this begins to cross over into my care for and work in advocacy circles. Like, the reality that Christians do, and I posted about this, that we begin to go down this hole of like, we need to be nice, we need to not offend, we need to hear all sides. And when you're talking about safeguarding children, no, this is why we have mandatory reporters, and I think that's very good, and churches need to learn this as a community, embrace it as a community, and operate as this, because there's a 4-month-old baby here, you know, and whatever's going on with this parent, something's not well that they're posting this. There's obvious overwhelm. We've both been there, right? 4-month-old sleep regression is a real thing. Like, I can remember sitting in my day, there wasn't Twitter to go to. I remember sitting in the corner at Barnes and Noble, looking through stacks of sleep books, being like, with my first child, how do I get my child to sleep? Because we need to sleep.
Yeah.
So I think all of that combines, and so of course it went viral because people are concerned. It begins to generate that interest, and I, in response to someone, got some pushback, kind of people saying, well, this isn't a thing, not all Christians, kind of thing, which I think is an understandable, easy defense, and had a stack of books to say, well, actually, not all Christians, yes, but there are Christian teachers actually instructing parents to do this, and here it is in print. Like, we have no way of quantifying how many people parent this way, but we certainly know that there are teachers encouraging it. This is not a outlier. Clearly, he doesn't think he's an outlier. If he's imagining this would be a help to followers of 100,000 followers or however many he has. And I think sometimes people in our own corners of the church are so myopic. I mean, I think my fellow Anglican who's referring to Baptist children as unwashed and unregenerate is so far down the rabbit hole of Anglican theology that doesn't realize what that is communicating to the wider realm. And I think probably similar with someone like Samuel, so far down that, the people in this Facebook group are so far in that they are unaware of how. I mean, to be fair, I think some are very aware, right? Some are very aware. The teachers are very aware. The instigators are very aware. But I think for some parents, how and believe that to let go of those things is to let go of Christianity, or to slippery slope, or there's so much fear, like, but if I don't, and you see this a lot, if I don't spank, then I'll never discipline my child, or Piper's article, which maybe we can get to Piper's article in the end, but I'm training my child to be shot, I think is what he says. Essentially, it's so outrageous. These banana stakes that are all or nothing, wrapped up in this very distorted theologies, or incomplete theologies. And it makes me think of, when you begin, I studied Koine Greek. I love looking at the Greek text. Your first semester of Greek, they will always tell you a little Greek is more dangerous than anything. I think this is about theology as well. A little theology can take you to some wild places. And even if the little you have isn't necessarily heretical, it can be incomplete, or can take this distorted presence in your practical theology then. And I think that's what we're seeing when this sort of thing happens. So then, long story short, then the pushback becomes, the usual, like, should someone do Matthew 18 to him? Like, do we need to follow Matthew 18? What do we need to do? And wow, people were really, really harsh. And then his reply included a lot of, the atheists and progressive Christians are out to get me, and the usual things. It becomes almost predictable, right? It mirrors what happens with church abuse systematically. I'm sure it happens in individual congregations, and things kind of get very messy very quickly. And understandably, I imagine it was an incredibly unpleasant experience to go through. Can you imagine, as a new parent? It's incredibly unpleasant, I'm sure, to be under the microscope in that way. I think multiple people reported him to CPS. People were quite overt about that on Twitter. And I think that's fair, honestly. I mean, I'm not sure what people are waiting for to take action, because we know domestic abuse happens, and you read those Facebook posts, and someone did ask me, like, why black out their names? Like, why should these people not? And I did, because a lot of them are several years old, and I don't know how helpful public shaming is in that kind of context to affect change. But in the moment of something happening, you're saying, what are we waiting for, when there are parents who genuinely believe their children are wicked, evil sinners, their infants are wicked, evil sinners, and they genuinely believe it's their God-given responsibility to discipline that. And for them, discipline equals corporal punishment. This is a recipe for all kinds of abuse. It's a nightmare. It's really a nightmare combination of abuse. And I think the people who are maybe more in the middle ground, who say, oh, well, when we're talking about spanking, that's not what we're talking about. Like, even the reel I stitched this week, you want to be like, oh, really? Because it is just all subjective, and it's just all sliding scale. Like, there is no prescription. So you do have parents who are ingesting this and saying, well, I guess my 8-month-old is sinning. I guess my 4-month-old not being able to sleep is sin, because they've been so saturated with the gospel, that kind of intensity. And I don't even know how to process that, because you think of how it enables so much harm in bananas ways. And I think maybe it would behoove, I haven't watched it yet. People have asked me about the Ruby Frank documentary or whatever, if I watched it, a few people did. Maybe it would behoove evangelical Christians to watch that, because I think it's easy to be like, oh, well, that's LDS or that's Mormons. That sounds bananas. You're going to be like, well, how different is it when someone is so motivated? You know, an LDS person believes 1,000% that their beliefs are accurate. So it becomes very, very dangerous very quickly. So I think Christians should be the loudest voices rejecting that. And I mean, I'm hoping to not be always returning to the topic of corporal punishment. I know it's a lot for putting content out and digesting that content, but I feel like, look, at best what we can say is corporal punishment is just a method, right? It's not biblically mandated. It's not anything. I think even if someone's like, well, I'm convinced that the way I do it could never possibly be harm, I think the reality that in our communities, tolerating it causes this kind of harm means we should set it aside.
Yeah.
She said it's just not, what are we even doing? It's just not worth it at that point.
I'm curious about what do you mean when they say the way that I'm doing it isn't harmful? Like, what does that
Right.
what does that mean?
I think there are people who would kind of, or at least what I hear. I mean, I don't know what people are actually doing in their homes, but what I hear from people who argue this is often they will be like, well, no, it's not that. It's just a swift snap. It's one time. Or they'll be like, my children don't, even when I posted that series with Ted Tripp, kind of like, let's talk about what's really happening. Let's stop using euphemisms and talk about it. To be like, well, no, that's not what I do. Like, what I do is swift. And then I think people just don't want to name what they're doing, understandably, but there's just a discomfort to even name to themselves. And I'd love it if you could repeat it here or speak to it more here, what you said about this, like maybe unacknowledged motivation that what we do to pre-verbal children, they will not name back to us later. And this idea of finishing up, getting the discipline and the instant compliance trained in at that age.
Mm-hmm.
And I never thought of it that way before. You know, you hear that a lot, like, do it young so you don't have to do it again.
Yeah.
And that just feels incredibly utilitarian and break the child's will and everything. But I had never thought of it from this, like, oh yeah, and guess what? You don't have a 6, 7, 8-year-old able to, when they reclaim their agency, say, I remember that spanking because it's so young.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, first, I just want to say, like, anyone who would say, like, oh, the way I do it, I would just, like, that makes zero sense, because anyone who is justifying and defending corporal punishment is going to say it has to be painful, right? Like, to be painful, like, that's the point. Otherwise, why do it, right? Like, if what you're doing isn't painful, then why do you have to? What about it is teaching? It's the
Right.
physical pain, right?
Right.
So that always strikes me as very hypocritical to say that, because
Yeah.
you know, that's the whole thing. It's a painful deterrent and a threat.
Yeah. Or they would somehow, and I always want to push back and be like, who are you to deter? Like, it's the whole parent God complex again. Like, are you so certain of your judgment and your self-control and your righteousness that you believe the amount of pain you can inflict on another human being is justified? Like, even if that thought process that you hear of, like Doug Wilson, who says it should be painful, like, goodness, are we gods that, even from the distorted theology that says God is like this, which I don't agree with. I don't hold to that. I think all of that is flawed. But even by that own way of thinking, you would think that people so fixated on doctrines of sin and depravity would question their own hearts and their own capacity to do this perfectly.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
But what were you going to say?
Yeah. So it just is, that whole thing, I just think, like, anyone who says they don't agree with Doug Wilson on that, I would say, well, then why would you, what's the value of corporal punishment without pain? Like, the pain is the purpose, right? That's the point. So I would, anyone who says they disagree with that, I would just push to question, okay, then why, what is the function of this? but yeah, so this is why I'm really interested in this, what I perceive as a new commitment to the use of spanking with young children. One, because I think it is relatively new. Two, because it is, depending on what you think discipline means, right? It's like you kind of work yourself into these mental, right? Because if you're a Christian parent who believes I discipline to teach, but I don't believe that my child understands anything but pain, you're basically admitting to a purely behavior project, right? Like you're admitting to a mode of discipline, which I would say is really just punishment or conditioning.
Conditioning's a helpful. I think conditioning is really helpful term. Go ahead.
It's just conditioning, and at that point, you need to say, what I am doing probably has nothing to do with God. It has everything to do with how I want my child to be trained. Incredibly dehumanizing way of thinking about another human being. We don't treat any other class of human being that way. We would never, I mean, outside of like high control cult environments, right? Like what other institutions use that treatment?
Well, and I would say we have in history. I mean, this is how we treat slaves. This is how we treat people who we believe to be subhuman all throughout history. This is how people in power dominate and control others. And so I do think it's directly related to that way of thinking as well, within its stronghold in American evangelicalism. I would be very interesting to see what Christians from other cultures perceive of that, because I heard from someone who said, I think it was in Germany, they say, of course, spanking is illegal here, but even if a parent did this, it would not be it would be collective shame if a parent was advocating for this. Like everyone would be astonished, but it would be the Christians would be the most objecting to it. I thought that was really interesting, a flip, and to kind of wonder how much of our imagination has been shaped by this way of dominating those we believe under us. That's so baked into the American love affair with violence and subjugation. So anyway, carry on.
Yeah. I think that's a fascinating difference that I would love to know more about. Just love to know more about parenting practices and literature in other languages, because it's the U.S. is very much an outlier in terms of the protections that are mandated toward children from their parents, which I also think is interesting. But I mean, returning to the commitment to spanking of pre-verbal children, this idea of get it done. I think at some point, I cannot remember what book it is, but somewhere James Dobson says, like, if your child is not obedient by age 5, you've failed, right? Like by age 5, that should be conditioned. That should be conditioned in.
And that's kind of become lore. You hear other people then reference that. It's kind of become parenting lore.
Yes. And so that makes it very clear that this is sort of a combination of like conditioning certain fear and also kind of building in this fear of parental authority coming in here. But as it has become less and less popular, not even less popular, less and less acceptable to be strikes your children. And like, we should be clear, that movement has been happening since the early 20th century. This is not a new thing. Like when people talk about, like, caving to culture right now, I want to say, look, this has been the norm elsewhere, like, for decades. This is not a thing.
Well, and I think that's so important for the younger Christian parents to hear, honestly. I saw somebody this week, often on Instagram, people will send me things, but a young mom, Christian parenting influencer, kind of projecting this conversation like in an anti-gentle parenting thing, as though this is the first time in the history of parenting or Christian parenting that the gentle parenting movement, whatever you want to think of by that umbrella term, is rejecting spanking. And that's simply not so. So then it can be presented as a sort of new threat to Christian orthodoxy and orthopraxy. And that's not so. There have been Christians throughout the ages who've rejected corporal punishment of children. Christians around the world do. It's not, rejecting corporal punishment does not equal adopting gentle parenting, whatever you believe gentle parenting to be. Like, rejecting corporal punishment means rejecting corporal punishment of children.
Yeah.
Like, to conflate the two is maybe I think confusing for parents, because I think there's some parents who then are like, oh, but I maybe don't hold to the gentle parenting philosophy, or I have concerns about that, or whatever. And so they think, oh, it's either that though, or spanking my 1-year-old. And that's, I think, a really unhelpful clarification, and let alone the problems like we talked about in the last live of imagining these whole movements just have zero discipline, whatever, things like that. So anyway, I think that's an important clarification. But yes,
yeah.
Yes. So you see it as something since you said early 1900s.
Yeah.
You've seen this.
Yeah, like early 1900s. And I think one other helpful clarification here is that at any given time, especially if you look at American parenting history, you will always find a camp of authoritarians and a camp of people pushing toward connection, attachment, gentleness. You will always find those things.
Yep.
Which voices are louder in the mainstream discourse, that shifts back and forth over time, but you will always find these different camps.
Yep.
You can always find someone who's kind of affirming whatever your particular concern is about your children, about kids these days, or whatever.
Yeah. And I think you'll always find the people saying kids these days are worse than they've ever been.
Yes.
That goes back to like ancient history. There's always someone's blaming parent, like you said in one of your last reels, the latest parenting methods on why children are turning out so poorly, and blaming the next generation for being undisciplined and horrible and all of this. That is a generational cycle we have.
It's a particularly American one because of the individualization, right? Like, we are for problems at the individual level to blame someone, and parenting practices in particular families, that's an easy way of sort of finding an individual problem for a massive social issue, right?
Yep.
It's very attractive and very easy to say, it's the permissive parents that are creating these social problems by producing the kinds of kids that do these things, but of course, always more complicated than that. Yeah. But where we are now, right? So we've had this whole century in the United States of movement away toward corporal punishment, movement away from it in the schools, movement away from it elsewhere in the Western world, to the point now where American Christians feel like this is one of the only places where we have freedom to parent the way we want to, right? Whether that's homeschooling or spanking. And so there's this commitment to it, this doubling down, but also this awareness that, like, okay, I could probably get in trouble for this.
Yep.
If my first grader went to school and told her teacher that he got spanked or hit over, like, I could be looking CPS at my door the next day. Teachers are reporters. So, I need to be real careful about how I use this. Either I need to be so sure that my kid is loyal enough to me that I need to scare them into not saying something, make them think it's so normal that they won't say anything, or we need to be dealing with this problem early on. And I think that has led to this shift in the psychology of spanking, where parents have had to push it earlier and earlier, and that's coincided with these doubling down on neo-reformed theology, and it's pushing the age of this punishment discipline, whichever one you want to call it. I would choose punishment.
I think it's it's better to name it accurately. I'm going to start doing that as well. Yeah.
And I think that there's a whole confluence of things happening here. It's not any of these one thing. But I do think that has led us to this point now where you have these reformed parenting circles really doubling down on spanking toddlers and really leaning into the idea of toddler sin nature, right? Like, there's this fascination with toddler and even infant sin nature, because we feel like we have to treat the problem so much younger, because if we wait, then we're going to lose the ability to do it.
Absolutely. And the ignorance of child development, I think, and suspicion of external sources of authority really contribute to this, because I think then the only framing parents are taking is this, my toddler touched the bookshelf when I said don't touch the bookshelf. That is their sin nature. Because I should be a godlike authority in their life, and they're rejecting that, and that means their rebellious hearts on display. And you see Piper use this logic in his argument, like the 7-year-old doesn't put away his tablet or whatever when the stewardess asks, and that's the parent failed to require that of them.
Yeah.
And so then it gets combined with this, and there was so much about that article. I may write a whole Substack post about it, because it's a train wreck. But what ends up happening then is this very convoluted thing with the power struggle, with the frustration a parent is understandably feeling, all of this. And yeah, it's a fixation on the individuation that happens. I don't know if that's the right word for it in the toddler age, but it replicates again in the tween years. But yes, this emerging sense of self, where a toddler is exploring and experimenting and discovering, I am not you. I am not with mom anymore. I'm a separate person. And what does this do? And I think one of the tragic things about it is, by withholding that information from Christian parents, they are unaware even of the God-given design of human development. Like if we who are Christians say God knit us together in the womb, that God's creation is wonderful, this developmental process from immaturity to maturity is God designed. And instead you have the bizarro writing of adult definitions of sinful behavior onto infants and toddlers, when a toddler is maybe exploring their world, or maybe tired, or whatever it may be. And instead it's willful defiance or challenging my authority. And I think it really begs the question, I think if we want to get uncomfortable, I have no problem making people uncomfortable. If we want to get uncomfortable, I would say it really pushes around our own spiritual formation as parents, that we would be so, even in that framework, are we so fragile that a child would defy our authority, that we cannot bear that? Even if you felt that way and thought that way, the idea then that there's no fruit of the Spirit in my life that could be patient or long-suffering or compassionate. It must just be swiftly dealt with. And then we present that as a virtue. Like, that is good because you are love your child so much that this hurts me more than it hurts you. And it's this very uncritically examined way where the parent is always in the right, always.
Yeah.
Always in the right. Now, maybe they don't feel that way, and there's shame and these things are hidden, but the way the formula is presented, the parent always remains in a role that's really unaccountable, unless the other parent is jumping in at all. Like, it's just up to the parent whether they examine their motives and discover that they were awry or something like that. So it's, I think, particularly for Christians who are so committed to doctrinal beliefs and to religious zeal, I wish some of that could be directed at their own behaviors, and not because I wish a heavy yoke on anyone. I think that's a heavy spiritual yoke, but I wonder if there would be maybe an ability to extend more grace to the children they perceive of in this way, if they were able to see the grace they're extending to themselves, if that makes sense. I'm not sure. I worry about a lot of families. I think it's a hard yoke for everyone involved in that, and a surprise down the road for a lot of families when it not only doesn't work, but it backfires. And I think it's a very confusing sort of thing. Yeah.
I think, yeah, you're right. I think there's this very deep fear instilled in a lot of evangelical parents that if they do not take a very stern view of sin, if they are willing to, the worst can do as a parent is potentially overlook something that's essential in your child. Like, if you need to name this, you need to see your child for what they are. Like, there's this like, you need to go into parenthood. Don't be fooled by your child. I see like a lot of rhetoric that seems to me to encourage parents to be afraid that their kids are constantly going to be taking it them, that they're constantly going to be pulling one over on you. They're going to be tricking you. They're going to be getting away with something. And that's like the worst thing as a parent, is for you to let them get away with it. And when I look at the example of Christ, when I look at the parable of the prodigal son, to go back to that, father is not concerned that the son has absolutely taken advantage of him, absolutely painfully so, like to the point of probably harming the livelihood of the father, which obviously we cannot do. That doesn't translate to this, but that's not the concern, right? Yeah. And but I had a fun
well, and I would argue it's never been the concern. Yeah. This is not the heartbeat of the Christian faith, is not forced compliance. It's never been that way. This is the gospel of grace we proclaim. It doesn't have to be cheap grace to proclaim it, to say, no, we genuinely believe that. And we genuinely believe you don't behaviorism your way into sanctification, that you can't bear that it requires miraculous transformation brought about by the Holy Spirit's indwelling. So all of these sort of things, when you zoom out, they are not doctrinally sound. You know, if you want to look at it from that, as like, what is the practical theology reflecting of the belief? It isn't alignment with the story of Scripture, with the salvation. Absolutely.
Right. And as a parent, why not be wronged, right? Like, I think like the question to me is like, why not be wronged? Because if the example of Christ is to be wronged again and again and to the point of death, what excuse do I have to not extend that kind of grace to my children, even as I teach them, right? That doesn't mean that, like, I'm never concerned with anything they do. Of course not. But like, I mean, just think about how you have a healthy relationship with another human being who isn't your child, right? Like, the idea of retribution in any other kind of healthy relationship is never, you know, right. You're never to do that to your spouse, to a best, you know, that kind of thing about.
And I think it's why you often see in a lot of these resources redefinition of terms as well. You see this with Wilson, where he'll redefine love, so it means this like painful punishment. Or you certainly see it in Nouthetic, you see it in Gothard's IBLP stuff. It's like taking things that we know that, though. We know that in relationships, that it's not loving to hit that person and cause them pain. Like, we understand that, but we jump through these hoops to redefine that. And I think a great majority of the time it's because we don't know what else to do. And so many of these parents have not been offered any of those tools. And that's what's so heartbreaking about those Facebook posts. Many of them are like, okay, I have this doctrinal belief and I don't know what to do, and it's not even working. And what should I do? And I think that's, maybe it's helpful to just say, I think that's the reality of parenting. Like, there's no one method that's going to ever make you be like, I figured it out and I know what I'm doing. But I do think there's this elusive, whether it's me looking through all the books so long ago, or people being like, well, don't follow this kind of parenting, follow this kind, or try this method. And we are looking for the one that works. We're looking for the one that will affect the change we think we need to see. And especially in the early years, I think that's why the 4-month-old post was so heartbreaking. You have no idea yet of the scope until you've walked through it, right? You don't know that it's just a season, that the toddler doesn't stay a toddler forever, and the sleep regression doesn't stay sleep regressed forever, and the teenage years don't stay teenage years forever. But I think when you're in it as a parent, you think, oh no, we need to course correct. Yeah. And then you maybe, I really liked, I shared it in my stories, that tweet from a father who was saying, we sleep trained with our first two, and then with our third, we didn't, and they all ended up sleeping in the end, and now I regret. I wish I would have rocked my kids a little more, you know, and we all carry regrets, right? There's no way around that. But I do think there is a sense that like our kids come through each stage, and then maybe we have the perspective to say, gosh, is it that I was on it so well with spanking that my 7-year-old isn't throwing tantrums anymore? Or is it that they came through the tantrum stage of human development and are not throwing tantrums anymore? And I think spanking advocates who argue for that want to look back and be like, it's because of the spanking.
Yeah.
That's
yeah,
why.
of course. Of course.
It's like you can't prove it. And so you're justified. Again, the parent is always in the right. Like, you're justified. The thing you chose is right. And I think it replicates, it's again that meta thing. The stakes are so high that parents in those systems, I think, cannot afford to be wrong. They believe they cannot afford to be wrong. There's no mercy and grace for them if they screw it up. The stakes are so high for their children and so high for them as a parent. And it replicates all of that on that level as well.
Yeah. Gosh, so much pressure. I like, you know, that I was horrified by those posts, but my heart is also just like so sad for all of those parents, because I know that there's probably just so much pain and anxiety driving a lot of that, you know, and just
yeah. Well, and a couple of them you see, like, I'm a Christian. I'm now a Christian. I'm a new Christian, so I don't know what to do. And I think whatever happens in those early years, the parent is training themselves. And I think maybe it's hard in the beginning, but they do train themselves. I think you have to. I don't think you can continue to mistreat children punitively and keep causing them punitive pain, especially the way it's described in those resources, where it's hours of training sessions. It's multiple times a day. It's this constant, very physical battle, as well as always seeing your child as aggressor. I think at a certain point, you are, oh gosh, it's such a betrayal. Whew, you are destroying your attachment with your child day after day after day after day. And I think there's always possibility to repair, but you don't get that back. And I don't get too personal as a parent very often. Neither of us do. We're committed to that. But I feel like as an older parent, I wish I could hug those younger parents and say, you just don't get those years back. And that's not, you don't want to destroy the fruit of that is heartbreaking. And you don't have to believe that if you are not doing these certain practices that are harsh and mistreating to the child who's been entrusted to your care, that your child won't be disciplined or can't learn to listen or will be this complete tyrant. Again, those languages, I mean, Dobson uses all of those language very early on, describing young children: a tyrant, a tigress, almost like an aggressive, predatory creature. And instead to think of the nurturing language we also see in scripture about discipline, which is why I'm really excited to do a Bible study on Ephesians 6:4, because when I stitched that reel, I started digging into it and I was like, oh, there's so much here to talk about. But one of the things was this idea of raising up children is connected with cultivating to maturity. It's not connected with punishing into compliance. And I think you even see that with the Proverbs. Like, even the people who want to look at the Proverbs, the point of the Proverbs is written to young men to help them make choices. It was not written to young men to beat them into compliance. It was given to them so they could cultivate wisdom. So the idea that it's ever been about beating people into compliance or requiring, as maybe we need to get to Piper, I don't know, we could talk forever. We could talk, I'm sure we could for hours. Thanks for hanging with us. We still have some people with us. But he really gets insistent that it has to be about requiring children to obey in all things. And I think it's such a incomplete, if you even want to say parents should require obedience, it just ignores a whole host of other ingredients to what it means to instruct and discipline and raise children. This one thing, punishing or requiring obedience.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. I don't know if you can hear, but my kid's room is next door, and I can hear something.
I can hear a little squawk.
Oh,
You do? Okay.
getting pretty close to dinner time. I think we might be
Are
getting close.
we winding down? Do we have time to do Piper, or should
Let's
we not?
do Piper next time.
Okay, we'll do Piper next time.
That article merits a deep dive into a number of problems. I mean, so many problems. We should even like post ahead of time a link to the article for people who want to read it before we talk about it.
Yeah.
So that they can look and see, because it really is what you call a rich text. So.
Well, and it keeps circulating.
Yeah.
Like I see it circulating on socials often, or people will send it around. And
yep.
Like, I think the one word I would say is it's like, yeah, the idea, he opens with children obey your parents and being like, that equals parents must make their children obey.
Yeah. Right.
So yeah, there's so much there. The starting point is fun. All of it is fun.
Yeah.
This is good.
Yeah.
The only other thing I wanted to say, I brought this when we were talking about stuff in the atonement in the beginning, because we started talking about the atonement. For anyone who's watching this now or later on, this book, I think, is the most amazing book out there. I don't know if you can see this, but she goes through, this is Fleming Rutledge. She touches on all the biblical motifs for atonement. And as a result, she touches on a lot of motifs of sin and how do we think about sin? How do we think about atonement? And so if you want to expand your theological understanding, I really recommend it.
Yeah. Yeah. You sent me a couple pages the other day from it and I loved it. So
yeah, it's so good. If you need to go, feel free to dash. I wanted to peek at some of the questions. Do you think, are you game for that?
A couple minutes here. Someone was asking about resources. You have a little like reel that you could repost about resources. I have not. I've been meaning to make a post about resources.
They're asking for recommendations or
for posts about people or resources for people who are
usually
looking to...
we do want to, in our book especially, include like some green light directions. I mean, understandably, I think when you start challenging some of this, people want to know, well, what should we, what's a good one? What's a trustworthy one? So I think, as always, I would much prefer to empower parents to think critically and be able to cultivate their own discernment to filter resources than to position myself or you to be like, here's what you should do. So we do often share kind of like green light metrics, like is a resource talking about child development? Is it talking about the life cycle of a human being? What is the theological bag? Even just asking the question, like, what is the theological lens here? Because sometimes it's not even identified. Getting very curious about definition of terms, like what are their terms? What are their credentials? All that kind of stuff. So I will post that. I love, if you're looking for Christian resources, I will always, personally, I recommend Connected Families to parents who I know in real life who ask me. As a parent, I have just learned a lot from them. I really appreciate their framework. I think it's really healthy and weaves in a lot of those things. Okay, someone's mentioning To Train Up a Child. Yes, definitely has all of this.
Recommended source. That's like that.
Oh yeah, sorry. I realized I'm reading. Hopefully that didn't need clarification, but I'm realizing I'm reading that right after recommending. No, that is an abuse manual. That is horrible. Someone asking where Christians find biblical justification for behavior modification and conditioning.
I mean, I think when you're told that you're responsible for your kid's sin, right? It's sort of like anything you can do to stop them from doing the thing, like I won't let you disobey me kind of thing, you know? Like if I condition you not to disobey me, you won't disobey me and you won't be sinning. So I mean, it's sort of this like weird logic, but yeah, it's sort of like flows from that.
It's really practical. And I think for many evangelicals, we're unaware of how influenced we've been by nouthetic counseling, because nouthetic approaches are behavior conditioning. Like they are, that is the bedrock of it. And even in fact, I still find it so fascinating. John, I think his name is Broger. He wrote Self-Confrontational, one of the early manuals that was a transcription of Jay Adams' original teaching. He went on to do like psyops for the US military for like kind of brainwashing type programs. I mean, he was a committed Christian. He was all in on this metric, but yeah, conditioning's a piece of that approach. So if you have resources, or if you are in churches or communities that value that approach, just know that a big piece of that really is um, conditioning behavior. Now we could have conversations about how theologically sound that is or not, but that is what's going on with
Yeah.
that. And I think the belief is that is how sanctification occurs. The Holy Spirit works through kind of self-conditioning via Bible verse application a little bit. So
Yeah.
if we believe in sinners at birth, original sin is maybe the term this person's thinking of. Why aren't we, they're saying, why is the term escaping me? So maybe they're thinking original sin. Why aren't we worried about producing little Pharisees? It's obvious we're practicing corporal punishment for ourselves as parents.
Yeah.
That's a great observation.
Yeah.
Great observation. I was
I'm going to
taught.
duck out here in a second.
Okay, sure. Should we close it up?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to stay and answer
I'll
some questions,
stay and answer any more questions, but if you need to go, we'll say farewell. Thank you so much. It's always
bye, everybody. Thanks. It's so great to talk to you too. I love doing these. I feel like we need to pick times that don't bump up against dinner time, so that
I know our
our
time difference
hear the
makes it
struggle.
wonky. But yeah, go be with your family. Thank them. All right.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for being here.
Let's see. Someone's saying, I was taught that cry it out was necessary because infants were trying to manipulate their parents into giving them attention. Absolutely. I have heard that as well. Just the idea that infants are manipulating, and so sad when you think about the giving them attention piece too, of like, just that is what infants need. That's how they're designed, to need attention and to cry, to have their needs met. Why not be wronged? Okay, I'm pinging for any other questions. Throw them in if you want. This feels kind of strange. It's kind of like recording a reel, I suppose, just talking. But I always thought, someone says, I always thought it was so hypocritical to tell your child they can't and shouldn't hit others while you actively hit them to discipline them. Yes, it is. And it requires, I think, kind of a convoluted way of even explaining that to a child, which maybe is why some Christian parents reach for, well, God does it, and because God does that, then it's okay if I do that. And then again, that remains unexamined. Like, does God actually do that? And even if someone comes to the conclusion he does that mean it's okay for a parent to do that? And why does that not apply to other authorities as well? Someone saying, this is why I looked into spanking for myself. It made no sense to me. I love it. I love hearing from parents who say that, or who were early on able to say, I felt this was out of alignment with scripture. I investigated it more. I was unwilling to operate in this way because I knew it was out of alignment with the way of Jesus. And so, yeah, that's a lovely, I applaud that every time. Do Piper next time, someone's saying. We will link the article. It is, I don't have it, I printed off. I don't have it titled, but we'll link it and I'll put it in the notes for this if I can edit the notes. I don't know. Someone missed this but want to send it to their kids. We will try and post it. It should auto post to Instagram as soon as I'm done here. And we've had some trouble getting them to upload on YouTube. I'll see if this one will upload onto YouTube. We're exploring the idea of doing different platforms for this, if there's a better way to do this that's more accessible. Someone saying, I trained mine with too much discipline, and when I was gentle, I was criticized and only just got out of it recently. Yes, there's so much pressure, I think, in Christian communities. I hear from some of you regional pressure as well. I think in different parts of the country, this is normalized, something everyone's doing, Christian or not Christian. In other parts of the country, not as much. And so some of that, there are other cultural elements going on, and it can be difficult. There can be a lot of judgment if you step away from it. And I think because there's some fragility there, because if you're choosing another way, there's an inherent judgment in that as well. Can I give the title of this book? Maybe this book, The Crucifixion, Understanding the Death of Jesus Christ by Fleming, Rutledge. It's amazing. It's amazing. Her footnotes are gold. It's brilliant. It's kind of like her magnum opus, like a life's work. And I could say more about it. Message me if you want to talk more about that. I will write it in as well. Someone say direct invasion. Oh, good. Okay, everyone's popping in. Green light metrics would be wonderful. I'll share. We have kind of a really rough one. Just a post I did. I'll share it in stories after this. Oh, good. Lots of people asking for the name of this book. I'm excited. Y'all are going to pick it up. What resources do you recommend for those of us who spanked but now think differently and want to help our future grandkids and other friends and family? Yes, I mentioned Connected Families. I'll mention it again here because I believe on their podcast, they sometimes have episodes specifically for grandparents. And I really appreciate that they recognize that. I love that. I love it. I don't know how rare it is, but to me, sometimes it seems rare that older parents who are already done with active parenting are willing to reflect back and actively engage in new ways. I think a lot of times it can be either forgotten or in the rearview mirror or a moment of fragility. So I think, and all the resources available to parents are certainly still available to grandparents. But yeah, that's one I like. Maybe some other people will hop into the comments on this if they have things they want to share as well. I think there's a lot out there on Instagram. I know there's a lot, but it all requires cultivation of discernment. And I think I ended a last post, and this last thing I'll say, because this feels strange. It feels really strange. I'm talking to y'all, I'm looking at your faces here, but this feels kind of strange. Is that there's so much freedom for the Christian parent. So we do have direct instructions to not provoke our children, to not embitter them, not to provoke them in anger, to not embitter them, and to bring them up, to raise them, to nourish them in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. And when I do that Bible study, I will get into what discipline and instruction means, because I think it's a product of our moment that we equate discipline with punishment. It included broad ranging concept of to correct, guide, instruct, teach, mentor, to disciple. So that's the work of parenting. But how you do that, there's so much freedom for the Christian parent to pull from a wide range of resources that suit your temperament as a parent, that suit the needs of the individual children trusted to their care, that suit the season of their life. There may be resources that are helpful in different stages than others. And because each child is unique, the kind of formulaic approaches really fall short. They inevitably fall short. So I think there is a lot of freedom so long as it aligns with the way of Jesus. And when I say that, I'm not meaning some vague way. I mean, if we say we are Christians who follow Jesus, that is our anchor of we are so familiar with his life and ministry, the way he lived on earth. We're so familiar with his instructions to us as Christians, which he summed up as love God, love your neighbor, including our newest neighbors, our littlest neighbors. But certainly all the New Testament instructions to Christians apply in the way we interact with our children. So I think those filters can help us discern what to do and which resources might be a help to us as we seek to do that. Anyway, okay, I'm going to wrap it up because this is just me rambling on now. And we are looking forward to the next live we will do. We'll be talking about the John Piper article, and who knows what else might come with it. Thank you all so much for joining us. It was a delight, and always good to have you with us for conversation. Bye.